2025 has been an exceptional year for Southeast Asian football. Vietnam showed why they were the foremost uh, football nation in the region, with the men being dominant as usual, winning the Southeast Asian Games as well as the ASEAN Football Federation Under 23 Championships, while the women qualified for the AFC Women's Asian Cup next year, as well as finish runners up in the Southeast Asian in the SEA Games Women's Football Tournament. And there were breakthroughs for Philippines and Singapore. For the Philippines women, they actually won the a historic first SEA Games Women's Football gold medal, or actually their first ever football gold medal, either for men or women, while their men's under 23 team had an impressive breakthrough year, reaching the semi-finals for both the AFF Under 23 Championship the as well as the semi-finals of the Southeast Asian Games Under 22 Men's Football Tournament. And Singapore qualified for the AFC Asian Cup 2027 Saudi Arabia on merit for the first time in its qualification campaign, and after beating Hong Kong in their penultimate group qualifying group match in November, they will appear in the Asian Cup finals for only the second time in the history. And while these three nations have substantial breakthroughs, for Thailand, while their clubs had prospered, particularly with Buriram United reaching the quarterfinals of the AFC Champions League Elite last season in the 2024-25 season, beating Johor Darul Takzim of Malaysia in the round of 16 before losing in the quarterfinals to eventual champions Al Ali of Saudi Arabia. But their national teams were a major concern, for their women failed to finish they failed to reach the SEA Games Women's Football Final for the first time in a very long while, which I'll elaborate more later. And also for the men, they've in their under 22 men's football tournament in the SEA Games, they only attained a third successive silver medal, which raises questions about how Thailand, though still talented, were not the force that they used to be, which I'll elaborate further in a separate point in this clip. Then what about the other countries? Malaysia, even though they are still leading in their Asian Cup qualifying group campaign, particularly after June's historic 4-0 victory over Vietnam at home, but initial rumors, which further was confirmed by FIFA investigation into the Harimau Malaya's use of 7 ineligible players, was left a black mark and eventually will cast a dark shadow over that historic win over Vietnam in over a decade. And that was also magnified by not just the documentation forgery or fraud, but also I think it raised questions on whether Malaysia could still reach the Asian Cup finals depending on their outcome of their appeal to the Court of Arbitration of Sports after their appeal to the World Football Governing Body FIFA was rejected. And as for the other nations, Indonesia, they sacked Shin Tae-yong, but they failed to qualify for the 2026 FIFA World Cup finals after they lost in the repechage fourth round to Iraq and Saudi Arabia, while their under 23 men's team finished runners up in the AFF Under 23 Championships on home soil, but were eliminated at the group stage of the SEA Games Men's Football Tournament. And as for the other nations concerned, Cambodia, even though they didn't have much to feature because they did not They did not qualify for the final round of Asian Cup qualifying, but their club, especially Priyakanrich Sering, had a very good 2024-25 AFC Challenge League campaign as they became only the second Cambodian club since Phnom Penh Crown in 2011 to reach an Asian Club final, although they eventually lost to the Turkmenistan champions Akadak in the grand final at home, while other teams, Myanmar finishing runners-up in the ASEAN Women's Championship this year, with the Australian under-23 side clinching the title now. And let's back to club level for Singapore in what I'm going through as a brief summary. Actually, for Indonesia, they also actually had a a decent year in youth development below the under 23 category. They featured in the group stage in the AFC under 20 Asian Cup finals in China this year alongside Thailand. Australia eventually won the tournament but were eliminated at the group stage of the FIFA under 23 World Cup held later this year, I think back in November, in Chile. And once again, the young Indonesians, this time round, the Junior Garudas, they reached the quarterfinals of the AFC Under-17 Asian Cup finals this year and reached the World Cup finals in Qatar for a second successive campaign, where they finished third in Group H after they achieved a historic win over Honduras, but they missed out on the place in the round of 32 because they did not finish among the 8 best placed third place teams at the end of the group phase. Then you have Lion City Sailors, who make history as the first Singaporean club to reach an Asian Club final in the 2024-25 AFC Champions League 2, where they eventually lost to Sharjah of the United Arab Emirates 2-1 right in injury time in the final held at Bishan Stadium in May this year. And then there was a very amazing achievement for the ASEAN All-Stars, where they stunned Manchester United 1-0, led by Vietnam head coach Kim Sang-sik. Myanmar forward Wang Wang Luin scored the only goal of the game at Bukit Jalil Stadium to embarrass the record English League champions who were in Kuala Lumpur for post-season tour, but unfortunately fell flat with a rather insipid performance and a last-minute team cobbled together by Kim with just a few days of training managed to upset the Red Devils in Kuala Lumpur to win this charity match. Now, with regards to the other notable features of the Southeast Asian teams, whether it's in the national team or club level, for the women's side, you have Ho Chi Minh City, who reached the semi-finals of the 24-25 AFC Women's Champions League, where they lost to eventual champions Wuhan Jiangda of China, where Melbourne City finished runners-up in that final. And where this is concerned, Lion City Sailors, the women's side, Stallion Laguna and ISPA of Myanmar made their AFC Women's Champions League debut this year, where only Stallion reached the quarterfinals alongside Melbourne City and Ho Chi Minh after the group phase. And on the individual front, Arif Aiman became the first Malaysian player and only the second Southeast Asian to be nominated for a major AFC award when he was in the final shortlist of 3 alongside 2 Middle East nominees, eventual winner Salem Al Dawsari from Saudi Arabia and Akram Afif of Qatar, for the much coveted AFC Men's Player of the Year, and thus becoming the first Southeast Asian nominee since the Sat Chaiman in 2003. So with this overall summary wrap up, now I shall go on to the main key points in which we are going to talk based on those topics after the recap of what has happened in a very eventful 2025. So first we begin by touching on Vietnam. Well, they are now the undisputed kings of men's football in Southeast Asia, having won the ASEAN Championship under Kim Sang-sik last year, ever since he took charge in the second half of that year. And he added with the SEA Games gold medal and also winning the AFF Under 23 Championship. And to cap it all off, Vietnam, he also guided Vietnam Under 23s to a place in next year's 2026 AFC Under 23 Asian Cup Finals, which will be held in Saudi Arabia next month. And this was the resounding verdict of the work that Kim Sang-sik has done to reinvigorate the Vietnamese after they suffered badly in the first half of 2024, especially in a very poor Asian Cup Finals campaign in Qatar, where they were eliminated under Kim's predecessor Philippe Troussier. So when Kim Sang-sik came on board, he had the urgent task of not only revitalizing the demoralized Vietnamese squad, but also to reinvigorate the young Vietnamese through the ranks. And the good part about Vietnamese football is for several years they have proven to be technically excellent, but it was only under the reign of Park Hang-seo that Vietnamese football achieved a major breakthrough. It's not just being the one-off ASEAN Championship winners once in a while, but beyond winning the ASEAN Championship, Park Hang-seo also then did the almost impossible when he also guided the Nguyen Quang Hai generation to the final of the 2022 AFC Under 23. I think the 2020 or 2022 the AFC Under 23 Asian Cup Finals, and also you can say led them to a gold medal. So the work that Park Hang-seo has done to become an adopted national icon for Vietnam, these were the big shoes that Kim Sang-sik had to fill, and Kim had done it in style. And this is partially because the Vietnamese recognize the values of which Park Hang-seo had taught. You can say whether it was the tough training or the never say die pursuit of achieving their goals, even when they had to carry the occasional injury, to fight for the cause, to play for the flag, or to instill that belief that they can outrun and outplay almost anybody on their day on the pitch. So what Kim has brought into the team was in part the reintroduction of the methods that had made Vietnam so successful under Park previously, but which was partially abandoned under Troussier. So, and that resilience was pretty evident, especially in the SEA Games men's football final, where they were initially trailing to an excellent Thailand first half, where the hosts led by 2 goals before Vietnam claw back to equalize and eventually win in extra time, for which the game's host had no answer for. So it was not just a question of technical ability, which was at least on par with Thailand, if not better, but more crucially, a stronger mental edge, the unwillingness to surrender, the pride for cause, to play for the collective. I mean, to complement the undoubted technical excellence that the Vietnamese had. Kim has managed to rebuild Vietnam into a regional force after that brief interruption under Trucier, where Vietnam fell short of their usual high standards. And the thing is, with the Vietnamese men, Kim has done such an excellent job that I think the moment AFC eventually announces the overturning of Malaysia's 4-0 win over Vietnam in the Asian Cup qualifying into a 0-3 loss, and another Malaysian game which will be overturned due to the fielding of ineligible players, Vietnam will eventually join Indonesia and Singapore as the Southeast Asian representatives for the 2027 AFC Asian Cup finals in Saudi Arabia. Now, with this success that Kim Sang-seng has brought, that has almost brought him level to his compatriot, South Korean compatriot Park Hang-seo, then the next question will be, alongside Shin Tae-yong, South Korean coaches have now proven to be pretty successful in Southeast Asia with the major football nations in the region. But Thailand, and to a limited extent Singapore, had Japanese coaches, but and even Indonesia for the women's side, they had Japanese coaches, but none of them had managed to excel. And that is in spite of, I think, one or two of them being big names back in Japan, notable for bringing their home national teams to achievement, which I'm referring to Futoshi Ikeda, the former Japan women's national team head coach, who guided the Nandan Shiko in the 2024 Paris Olympic women's football finals there. The Japanese seem unable to replicate their domestic excellence into Southeast Asia, while the South Koreans were able to do likewise, which was why Shin Tae-yong's shock departure from the Indonesian national team setup after he failed to guide the experimental young Garudas into the ASEAN Championship semi-finals cost him the job. That shock and outpouring of grief from the Indonesian fans was very evident, in the same way as how the Vietnamese poured out their feelings to Park Hang-seo when he left Vietnam, and are now celebrating the success that they have regained under Kim. So you do wonder, why are the South Koreans so successful in Southeast Asia in recent years, where in contrast the Japanese had faltered? And let's recap a little bit specifically for this year. When we talk about the South Korean coaches, Shin Tae-yong was unfortunately removed by PSSI President Eric Tokyo at the start of the year, but Vietnam had Kim Sang-sik, while when it comes to Japanese coaches, there were a lot more. Thailand initially had Matsada Ishii as the men's national head coach, Futoshi Ikeda as the women's national team head coach, and Takayuki Nishigaya, the former Singapore head coach, being in charge of the men's under-23 team. And while in Indonesia, they kept faith with Satoru Mochizuki as the women's head coach after he guided the Puteri Garuda to success in the AFF Women's Cup that saw them qualify for the AFF ASEAN Women's Championships, which was held earlier this year. So what happened instead was, all four of the Japanese names I mentioned, all four were sacked, and there was actually a fifth Japanese, Tsutomu Ogura, who used to coach the Singapore men's national team. Unlike in Ogura's case, he actually left after the Japan Football Association offered him a job in the technical department, which he took up. And save for Ogura, the other four all were sacked after failing to produce. In Futoshi Ikeda's case, he paid the price for failing to guide the Thai women through to the AFC Women's Asian Cup finals in Australia next year, as well as faltering in the AF ASEAN Women's Championship. These two poor tournament outputs saw the former Japan national women's head coach lose his job. Then you got Takayuki Nishigaya, who unfortunately had a disastrous spell in the Singapore men's national team and proved to be equally disastrous for the Thai under 23 men's national team, to the point that they had to replace him with 1998 Asian Cup men's football hero Tavachai Damrong Ontraku to helm the team for the SEA Games, where they managed to reach the final only to lose to Vietnam after having a 2-goal lead. And about those young Thai players, that will be the next topic I'll be touching on after I talk about the Japanese and the Korean divide that I'm discussing now. So, for the Japanese, why did they fail? Masada Ishii came relatively close. He was having not the best, but it's also not the worst Asian Cup qualifying campaign. But apparently the Football Association of Thailand Technical Committee saw enough and decided to sack Ishii with one more qualifying game to play, where the winner takes all final qualifier between Thailand and Turkmenistan on 31st March. So, with that sudden sacking, where now an Englishman Anthony Hudson is now the caretaker head coach of the War Elephants, there's no more Japanese presence in the Thai national team football setup after having three of them at the start of the year. Three. Then what about Mochizuki? He was sacked after he failed to guide the female Garudas to the semi-final of the ASEAN Women's Championship and was replaced by another Japanese, Akira Higashiyama, who actually led the Merah Putih to 4th place in the SEA Games Women's Football Tournament, with their only win coming against Singapore in a 3-1 win that was dominated by the overseas-born Indonesian players, particularly the Dutch-born players. So you can see to a certain extent how much the influence of those foreign-born players that they had compared to Singapore, who had an all-local women's football squad for the SEA Games. So you can say that for quite a period of time, whether it was Park Hang-seo or Shin Tae-yong, both work to instill somehow a certain level of discipline and push them really hard and make the players believe that they could do more than the sum of the individual parts. That was why Indonesia, in a way, overachieved, not just with the men's national team that reached the 4th round of the World Cup Asian qualifying, but also in 2024, where Shin brought the under 23 side all the way to the Olympic Games intercontinental qualifying playoffs. So you can say that there was, in spite of the working environment that Shin had to work under, he was able to deliver results. Same with Park Hang-seo, who was given more leeway after guiding Vietnam to a historic national team Asian final of any level. So the players understood them, the players understood and believed, and also because the Koreans knew how to adapt. They are a lot more adaptable. That's why the Koreans in general, whether it's your players and also coaches, they adapt in certain areas while instilling the fundamental beliefs that help make them successful in the Asian level as players, or to a certain extent coaches, but more as a players and the reputation that they had, especially with Shin, who actually guided South Korea in the 2018 World Cup finals in Russia. On the other hand, I think you can see it was the Thai impatience that led to the sacking of Futoshi Ikeda, but I will also add a bit later why even hiring Ikeda could not stop the decline of the Thai women. But at the same time, you have to also understand that Ishii did not have a spectacular stint with the War Elephants, but was not having the worst of it. So that second came quite abruptly. But the Japanese as a whole, while they are advanced in their football training methodology, in their football thinking, I think their frustration come in the way that the Koreans understood, but not exactly the Japanese, where the Japanese knew what is the best method of football, but at times that local resistance, you may say language barrier, but the Koreans also had their own language barriers but were able to overcome them. Shin Tae-yong rarely spoke English, neither did Kim Sang-sik, neither did Park Hang-seo, but they were able to get their points across effectively to the players. But the Japanese, for some reason, weren't able to inject the same one. So it's probably a bit of the cultural side of things, that where the locals understood more from the Koreans than the Japanese. Then you got, I mean, in Ikeda's case, he was unfortunate to take over the reign of the Thai women, where their standards were declining from their previous heydays as women's kingpins in Southeast Asia, while Nishigaya was just really can't cut it. Really, he can't cut it. Then what about Mochizuki? I think it's more on the Indonesian impatience that cost him the job in the end. So overall, it's down to different factors that led to the Japanese vacating their coaching hot seats by the time this year is over, 2025. Now, having spoken about the comparison between the Japanese and the Korean coaches in Southeast Asia, there is also another factor that has come into play, which I've spoken a little on, especially when I touch on Indonesia, where they not only had mass heritage player naturalization for not just the men, but also more quietly in recent months, the women as well. Yes, that was the main reason why the Indonesian women were able to reach the SEA Games women's football semi-final despite not having a national league. This was actually thanks to these ladies. Because without these ladies, it was highly possible that Singapore, who actually took the lead against those Indonesians, they could have either hung on to the lead or at least played to a draw that would have safely secured passage into the semis. But the Indonesia had those Dutch players who turned the game around with these few crucial moments of brilliant individual skill. Whether it was Claudia Schooneman, who also scored against Singapore in the 2024 AFF Women's Cup, or there are Dutch players who actually contributed to the equalizer and forced the own goal for their second. It was that individual flair that allowed the female Garudas to reach the last four of the SEA Games women's football tournament. Then, how about, you can say that for the women's side, but how about the Indonesian men? This is where it gets a lot more interesting, because almost all the national teams are using naturalization. In the case of Singapore and Vietnam to a limited extent, but you can see mass naturalization when it comes to Indonesia, Malaysia especially. This is where they are overly focused in boosting the national team level quality overnight. Saw Malaysia having 7 players from nowhere before their qualifier against Vietnam, and already one of them, Hector Hever, had already featured in Malaysia's opening qualifier against Nepal, where no one suspected a thing, even though people were curious about Hector Hever. where he scored on his debut international appearance. But it was those Spanish speaking contingent, the Latinos, who actually caused the bigger controversy at the backdrop of that 4-0 win over Vietnam in June, which left Kim Sang-sik's um, Vietnam squad rather stunned. I think you can say bewildered over the magnitude of such a defeat, which, as I've said earlier, it is soon to be overturned into a 3-0 win that would eventually allow the Vietnamese to take their place in the 2027 Asian Cup finals in Saudi Arabia. So, you got that. You got. Then even Thailand, they also had naturalized players who had some Thai blood, and the Philippines. The Philippines were particularly clever, which I said in the beginning that the Philippines are the breakthrough football nation for this year 2025 because of their men's under 22 or the under 23 squad, where they followed not just on the men's national team where they relied on foreign trained players of Filipino heritage, but also because of their dual passport policy, which allowed those players with Filipino heritage and Filipino blood to declare their international allegiance to the Philippines. And having previously done that successfully with the generation that had the young husband brothers as well as Stefan Schrock as the main faces that that cohort, now it's a different cohort that has been doing well with the Philippines men's national team in the Asian Cup qualifiers, where they, like Thailand, they also face a do or die final qualifier against Turkmenistan on 31st of March. So Philippines are in a good position to qualify for their second ever Asian Cup finals since 2019. And in the under 22 team, they not only reached the last four of, boosted by those players, they not only reached the last four of the AFF under 23 championships, but also reached the semi-finals of the SEA Games football tournament after upsetting Indonesia, who actually also had a number of Dutch players in the SEA Games squad, 1-0 in the group stage. So, for the Filipino men, this was a very good year on the national team front. And for the Philippines women, they were also having a fruitful year as well. They not only reached the AFC Women's Asian Cup finals, which will be held in Australia in March next year, but also for the first time ever won the SEA Games football gold medal. Yes, first ever gold medal in football, whether it was men's or women's, but it was actually in the women's front. After they won on penalties, having been fortunate to escape from an actually legitimate goal from the Vietnamese women that was ruled offside by the Laotian assistant referee. But that the Filipino way of naturalizing those players through Filipino blood was a crucial factor behind their major breakthrough this year. Thailand, not so much. Although you can't fault Thailand for, the Thailand men for keeping up to a certain level in the senior level in the main international team, but for the under 22s, they relied mainly on the local born players. There's no, I think, if at all, there's at least just only one heritage player for the Thai squad that reached the final of the under 22 men's football tournament. Now, what about Indonesia? The ones who started the arms race of those naturalized players through heritage means, whether their parent or grandparent was born in Indonesia. Well, unfortunately for Indonesia, despite having such a large contingent of Dutch players and having hired Patrick Kluivert to do the job, Indonesia unfortunately did not qualify for next 2026 World Cup finals. Not good enough still. Then, despite having a few of them eligible to play for the under 22, they somehow managed to not qualify for the semi-finals of the men's SEA Games football tournament as well. So it is a double-edged sword, but poor tactical coaching or planning, whether it was under Clivert and his coaching team or under Indra Sabjari at the under 23 level, that was costly. So this showed that it this showed how naturalization or through the heritage players, it can be a very huge double-edged sword. Then what about the national teams that didn't rely as much? Vietnam, they did not have their Brazilian-born Yuan Xuan Song for much of this year after he suffered an injury in the final of the ASEAN Championship. Singapore only had two foreign-born players in Song Wee Yong and Kyoga Nakamura, although they have quite a number of heritage players, but the caveat for those heritage players is all those other heritage players such as the Stewart brothers, Jacob Mahler, and Jordan Emimawe or Abdul Razak, who all had either European or African um, descent. But for these players, their lives were centered mainly in Singapore. None of them had their overseas football training. They had learned their football in Singapore. They had played their football here. They were trained in those academies or clubs, and they had their schooling and national service in Singapore. So they were as legitimate, proper Singaporeans as with the rest of the local bonds, because they were also local born as well, despite having mixed ancestry. Or then you also have the Fandi brothers, especially Ilhan, who was the hero with an assist and a goal that brought Singapore to the Asian Cup finals. But they are not naturalized players. They are born and bred, just that they have a parent who is not a local born. So in this context, it's only just two naturalized players. So they showed that with a decent network, I think whether it was through their positioning away from football as a global city where you had foreign wives or foreign husbands that decided to settle down in Singapore, or in Vietnam's case where the naturalization of foreign players for the national team was very selective. It showed that by having the core centered on local born players, it provided a greater cohesive national identity, that they feel that they belong for those to play for the nation, to play for the flag, in the way that perhaps a number of the Indonesian local bonds do not feel the same way. The Filipinos, because they are mainly a basketball nation still, despite the great strides Philippines had made in Asian football over the years, it's still not the main sport for the Filipinos yet. But for the local bonds, I think you can say it is more uphill, because it's a more uphill task, especially for those in Malaysia, Indonesia, to a limited extent Thailand, is because they had those players, foreign born players, who take those spots, and unless you're of Arif Aiman level, it's otherwise quite difficult to break into the starting 11 of those national teams. Not easy, it's not impossible, but it can be quite difficult, particularly for Indonesia. So that was the one aspect. Then you also have another factor in your proliferation of foreign import quotas, which see the biggest clubs in Southeast Asia step up many foreigners. Whether it was Johor Darul Takzim Malaysia, Line City Sailors of Singapore, and more recently Persib Bandung of Indonesia, Then you also have your Thai clubs who have also all these leagues, they have expanded the foreigners quota. And then you also have Cambodia who also expanded their foreign quota as well. So the expansion of foreign quota allowed more foreign players to come to those leagues to play for the leading clubs in those respective nations. And as a result, there are fewer places for local born players, fewer places, and as I said, unless you are of Arif Aiman or even in Sailor's case, the highest Harun level, to be able to adapt around the huge influx of foreign players that have come to Southeast Asia in the last 2 seasons, at least the last 2 seasons. And this was because of the caused by the AFC, where they allowed the proliferation of the foreign player quota to unlimited thanks to the Saudi Arabians. So it's a domino effect. The Saudis started this, the AFC follow, and because the AFC said now every club that plays in Asian club competition can have unlimited foreigners, the leading teams in each of those Southeast Asian football nations, they are also doing the same. And the leagues as well, then this lead to the leagues expanding the number of import quotas to the other clubs as well, whether they can financially afford it or otherwise. So so this proliferation of foreign players in those leading clubs, it has actually at least momentarily see the Southeast Asian clubs competing in Asia, especially in the ACL2, yeah, the ACL2, and to a certain extent for Johor and Buriram in the AFC Champions League elites, they can see themselves matching on par with the Koreans and the Chinese clubs, because these two national leagues, until the end of this year, they have insisted on a quota on foreign players much less than those in Southeast Asia, less than half even if those clubs like Shanghai Port, they could afford up to 7 or 8 import players, but they could only field this many in domestic games. So this impacted on their Asian Asian club performances. Same for the Koreans. Although after the end of the 25 K League season, where they have finally decided to lift the ban on foreign goalkeepers and increase the quota gradually. So, but for this moment, because of the influx of so many import players from primarily in Europe and South America, it has seen the quality of those leagues raise momentarily to be on par with the Chinese and the Koreans. And even though the Japanese, they also have a quota, but their high level of technical excellence is already at the world level, so it is a very different story altogether. Now, so in light of this shifting landscape, not just for the national teams but also for Southeast Asian clubs in general, the attention will now be turned to the football associations in the region. For the football association presidents who have held their respective head of the FA roles for much of this year, there are a couple who have shone, one or two stuck in the middle ground, and you go one exceptionally horrendous case. One really horrendous case. And I'll touch on that quite briefly. So, who deserve the praise for their involvement in football as the head of their respective FAs this year? So, two names stand out. The Vietnam Football Federation President Trung Kok Kwan, who has steadily gained prominence in the football circles, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Asia as well, and increasingly in FIFA levels, where he was appointed to the FIFA Executive Committee by Gianni Infantino and has already attained a certain status within the Asian football fraternity as one of the most trusted football administrators in the vast continent. Then you have a Chinese-born Singaporean billionaire Forrest Lee, whose largesse on Lion City Sailors, whose former name was Home United, since he bought over the club and made it into a private entity in 2020. That huge investment that he has put into the Sailors has seen them qualify for the Asian Club Final for the first time, a first for Singaporean club football, but also ever since he was elected as the Football Association of Singapore president under the current council that will serves its 4-year term until 2028. He has already in that space of a few months, I think he has been instrumental in guiding, I think with the improvements in the, you can say, the payment scheme for the national team players in particular. This in turn led the Lions to perform in the Asian Cup qualifying, particularly with their win over Hong Kong that sealed their place in the Asian Cup finals in Saudi Arabia. So one of them is down to very capable football administration. He played the role in the hiring of Kim Sang-sik. So that allowed, and he has been around in Vietnamese football for at least a couple of decades. Previously as a Secretary General, and now as a president of his home FA, and also a respected administrator in the Asian and world football circles. The other one is because where Singapore, in spite of its advanced economic status, is in football terms a very third world nation. So the money that Forrest had pumped in, Lee Xiaodong had pumped in, was pretty consequential, including the 2 million bonus for the national team after they qualified for the Asian Cup. So for these two presidents, they were the best performing FA presidents in Southeast Asia for 2025. You got to feel a bit for the Football Association of Thailand president, I mean Nampuan Lamsa, and also better known as Madam Pang, and because she came into the role promising to reform, I think, certain areas of Thai football, which while she successfully did with a new TV deal with the Thai league clubs, the rest, unfortunately, while she was not the product or the cause of what is happening in Thai football, but she was the unfortunate president to oversee what was essentially a gradually declining status of Thai football, where they were once powerhouses in both the men's and the women's, but now they are no longer the best. They are just one of the better ones, better football nations in Southeast Asia. The Thai women, whom she had bankrolled for and supported as team manager, including overseeing their World Cup finals campaign in, let me see, in 2023, and also I think, if I'm not wrong, in 2019. Yeah, 2019 and 2023, as the women's team manager, she saw the Thai women's national team fail to qualify for the Asian Cup for the first time in a long while. And to compound matters, the Thais failed to win the gold medal in the SEA Games and the ASEAN Women's Championship. So this is down to the gradual decline of the Thai players, women's players, even though they have more players playing abroad, whether it was in Taiwan or one or two in Japan or one or two in Singapore as well, but the decline has been evident. Then you got the failure of the men's under 22 team to win as well. So she's now the unfortunate president to oversee the gradual decline of the men's and the women's national teams and the football ecosystem. So she's really stuck in that no woman's land where this is concerned in terms of her administration in the Football Association of Thailand. And what about Eric Thohir, the TSSIA president, who is also now Indonesia's sports minister? He was the guy who decided that after hiring Shin in 2020 to fire the previous incumbent, I mean to fire the same guy he appointed at the start of this year, hired and fired Patrick Kluivert, more for the brand name but also to pacify the Dutch contingent in the Garuda's setup, and then also saw the Garuda's World Cup qualification campaign fall flat even though they achieved a historic 1-0 win over China in more than half a century, but they fell flat in the fourth round. So, and they still do not have a women's league despite the women's players petitioning Eric Thohir to do so. So this has not been a good year, and especially once the World Cup dreams ended with the men, that's where the ramifications are being felt right now in Indonesian football. And spare a thought for the now former FVM president Johari Ayub, who was elected unopposed as president in February but quit in August, just over 6 months after he was appointed. And I think this was in part had to do with the subsequent blowing up of the falsifying of birth certificates of those 7 players who were introduced to the Malaysian national team this year, who were instrumental particularly in the 4-0 win over Vietnam in June. And it's part of the fallout from that resignation where he really did not contribute much, but I think saw the danger enough to leave, was partially down to a poor working relationship with the now former Secretary General Nur Azman Hamzah, who is now suspended for his duties, who is indicted for his central role in the document forgery scandal surrounding Harimau Malaya, and who is now the central point of investigation after FAM comically filed a police report earlier this month after an independent judicial inquiry made them do so. So there was that. Then, having said quite a bit, but I've not touched on Thailand yet. Thailand, their players are still talented. The crop of players that are still producing are still qualifying for the Asian Youth Finals and all. But something is quite amiss from the under 22 level and above. It's not because of a lack of technical ability, but 3 successive men's SEA Games silver medals, especially in 2025 where they squandered a 2-goal lead in the final, and in 2023 in Phnom Penh where Thailand were more interested in playing Muay Thai against the Indonesians than football, and losing to Vietnam in the final in 2022 in the rescheduled 2021 SEA Games. You can see that there's something that is missing, that is not seen from these Thai players compared to the likes of the dominant 90s golden generation of Katisu Senamuang, Dusit Chalamansang, Surachai Jatuh Pataprapong, or even the more recent strong group of players from the likes of Tiraton Bumantan, Chalatip Songkrasin, Tirasil Dangda. It's like that mental strength, or rather the increased mental fragility in those young Thai players have seen them lose that spark of dominance, supremacy, and the winning mentality that the Vietnamese have now seized with both feet. And it's not about how good the Thais are technically. It's more about how to win as a team that is now sorely missing in these Thai players these days. Chanathip Songkrasin cannot be around forever. The same goes for Thirasil Dangda, and also the same goes for, already Kawin has already retired, and one or two others who have been stalwarts are also no longer around. And these are the players who are now going to form the core of the Thai national team. And you can say that this mental fragility is costing Thailand more than the lack of technical excellence, which, to be fair to the Thais, they still have it in terms of individual technical ability, but not on how they win as a team. This is very evident in the young male Thai players. So it is a very concerning problem for Madam Pang and as well as the technical team, because it's evident that the foreign coaches are not able to do so, neither do the local coaches. And even though the Thais behave better in the SEA Games, they didn't start a fight, they didn't throw their kicks at bodies instead of the ball compared to the 2023 counterparts, but their inability to overcome being packed back in normal time by Vietnam and not being able to find solutions after their brief periods in trying to score to find the winning goal fell flat in extra time. It says more about these players and you can say the mental state, or rather the mental toughness of those players at the final hurdle, that it's really lacking in Thailand these days. So Thailand is in a way a declining, it's still a powerhouse in Southeast Asian football, a powerhouse, but it's no longer the dominant force because this has been taken now by Vietnam. But Thailand has to find a way to figure out how to regain that winning edge, that winning mentality that has not been seen this decade under this group of players. So there's that. So having said quite a lot about 2025, we will now look ahead into the coming year 2026. So first, the Asian Cup qualification. Indonesia achieved it in 2024 thanks to their advancement into the third round of World Cup qualifying. Singapore achieved it in November this year. Vietnam soon to join them pending the AFC ruling on the Malaysia Asian Cup qualifying matches where they used those 7 players. Now, it's now down to Philippines and Thailand, where their final do or die qualifying game are up against the Central Asian teams. For Philippines is against Tajikistan, for Thailand is against Turkmenistan. It's either win or bust, because for both Southeast Asian nations they cannot draw because the Central Asians have the advantage. And if both Philippines and or Thailand manage to win, you will see Southeast Asian representation maintained at 4 like how it was in 2023, or increase to a record 5 if both Philippines and Thailand prevail on 31st of March. Then for the first time ever, the ASEAN Championship, which will now be known as the AFF Hyundai Cup, it will now be held in the summer months or the mid-year of July and August after the World Cup finals in North America. And this will be the first time Southeast Asia will have their flagship men's national team football tournament held at this time of the year. While it's the most sensible option given that more Southeast Asian leagues are shifting from the autumn to spring calendar, questions remain because there are a few questions. Vietnam, can they defend the title, especially with Thailand possibly being hungry to reclaim lost pride? Malaysia, if they are allowed to enter, this could be their main test of the year. And little Indonesia and Singapore who will want to show that their qualifications are no to into Asia are no flukes. But given also, as I mentioned, the naturalized players, the heritage players, some of whom are still playing in overseas leagues in Europe and Asia, will the likes of Jay Itzes, Dion Koos, Kevin Dix, and more will they be released by their clubs to join the respective national teams to play in the biggest regional competition in Southeast Asia, or unofficially known as the Southeast Asian World Cup? That will be interesting because it clashes with the J League and the Europeans pre-season, and also their pre-season plans could be thrown into disarray if these players were allowed to be released to play in the ASEAN Championship. And then there's also that looming spectre of the FIFA ASEAN Cup, even though there are no concrete details at this moment, apart from the announcement by Gianni Infantino, which was made during the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur back in earlier this year. So this will be the key crux of it. Then you have your AFC Women's Asian Cup finals in Australia. Can Philippines and or Vietnam make it two in a row for second successive finals appearance in the FIFA Women's World Cup 2027, which will be held in Brazil that year? Because Philippines and Vietnam also qualified for the 2023 Women's World Cup in the last edition. So it will be interesting to see whether they can repeat that for, I think, just a short context for the Women's World Cup qualification for Asia. It really begins from the Women's Asian Cup finals, where the four semi-finalists and the winners of the playoff spots for the two spots for the losing quarterfinalists, 6 spots for Asia, the last two losing playoffs from the losing quarterfinalists will then proceed into the intercontinental playoffs. This is where much is at stake. The top 8 have potentially, whoever reaches the quarterfinals after the group phase will have a huge chance of qualifying for the World Cup finals. That means 75% chance. So when that happens, whether Philippines and Vietnam will join the party, that remains to be seen. But it will be interesting to see whether these two Southeast Asian nations could join their AFF member Australia in the finals. Yeah. So I think with that, this is a wrap up of what has happened in Southeast Asian football in 2025, and also I think the issues that had happened in the region over the past year, and also a brief look at what is going to happen in 2026. For Southeast Asian football, let's hope it's a better year for all the ASEAN nations, football nations, in the coming year ahead. So in advance, Tanya wishes all the Southeast Asian football fans, clubs, national teams, and football associations a happy 2026 ahead.